The night air hung heavy over the quiet village, carrying with it the faint scent of rain-soaked earth and wood smoke. Lanterns flickered in the windows of small wooden homes, casting soft golden halos onto the dusty street. A lone horse neighed somewhere in the distance, its sound breaking the silence like a warning. It was the kind of night where every shadow seemed to breathe, where secrets hid behind every shuttered window, and where something was about to shift, whether the townsfolk were ready or not. On the edge of town, near the black line of the forest, stood an old barn. Its boards were rough and weather-worn, but it held the kind of quiet that suggested more than farm work had taken place inside. The faint creak of the door echoed into the night, followed by a soft gasp. "Don't stop," she moaned, the words spilling out like she'd been holding them back for too long. A deep, unhurried chuckle followed, the kind that carried both warmth and danger. "Darlin', I haven't even started yet," he whispered, his fingers digging into the rough wooden beam as if steadying himself for what was coming. The barn held its breath, listening to the charged silence between them. It wasn't what it sounded like to anyone passing by. Their meeting was layered with something deeper, something that went beyond whispers in the dark. Earlier that day, the village had been alive with the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks and wagon wheels clattering along the main road. Traders had set up their stalls along the dusty square, offering everything from salt blocks to lace ribbons. Children darted between wagons, chasing each other while mothers shouted warnings from porches. It was a picture of simple life, but beneath it lay a hum of unease. The harvest season was drawing to a close, and with it came rumors. Strange footprints near the creek, whispers of missing livestock, travelers passing through with wild stories about men who vanished without a trace. The sheriff had brushed it off as campfire talk, but the older folk knew better. There were patterns to these things, and old patterns had a way of repeating. She had arrived in the village only a month before, stepping off the stagecoach with a suitcase in one hand and fire in her eyes. No one knew much about her, except that she carried herself with a confidence that didn't belong to a woman alone in these parts. She rented a small room above the general store and kept to herself, but folks watched. In a town where news spread faster than wildfire, mystery didn't go unnoticed. He, on the other hand, was the kind of man people spoke about in lowered voices. He worked the land outside of town, on a ranch that stretched far beyond what most people ever saw. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always a little dusty from the fields, he carried a reputation that made men cautious and women curious. Some said he had once ridden with outlaws. Others whispered he'd made a deal with the railroad men, the kind of deal that left others buried in shallow graves. Their paths had crossed for the first time in the blacksmith's yard, where sparks flew from both the forge and their locked eyes. He had tipped his hat, and she had given him a look that was neither shy nor forward, just knowing. From that moment on, something unspoken began to stir. The townsfolk saw them talk sometimes in hushed tones near the well, or share brief glances across the dusty street. No one knew what they were planning, but it was clear that their connection wasn't a passing flirtation. It was like two storm fronts meeting, building something powerful and unpredictable. That night, when she slipped out from her rented room and made her way through the narrow alley behind the general store, the moon was hiding behind thick clouds. She moved quickly, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her boots barely making a sound. She wasn't supposed to be out there, not at that hour, but something pulled her toward the edge of town, toward that barn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and old wood. A lantern hung from a nail, casting a warm, flickering light that barely reached the corners. He was already there, leaning against a beam, waiting. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms marked by years of hard work. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing his eyes, but his smile, slow and dangerous, was unmistakable. She closed the door behind her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was louder than words, charged with everything they weren't saying. When she finally broke it, her voice was a whisper, almost trembling but not from fear. "Are you sure about this?" He pushed away from the beam, stepping closer until the light caught the edges of his face. "You're the one who came," he said softly. "I had to," she replied, her gaze steady. "They're watching me. I heard them talking outside my window." His jaw tightened. "Then we don't have much time." That was when she reached out, her fingers brushing the worn wood between them, her breath catching. She wasn't talking about romance or games. She was talking about plans, dangerous plans, plans that could turn the quiet village upside down. He leaned closer, his hand pressing against the beam just above hers. "Once we start," he murmured, "there's no going back." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I came tonight." The chuckle that followed wasn't light. It was laced with determination. "Darlin', I haven't even started yet." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn's loose boards. A horse whinnied nervously, sensing what the humans inside were only beginning to face. From the dark tree line, a faint figure shifted, watching. Back in town, a lamp flickered to life in the sheriff's office. A deputy stumbled out, rubbing his eyes, muttering about a strange sound he thought he'd heard. The night had changed. Something had been set in motion. Inside the barn, their voices lowered into an intense conversation about maps, routes, and names neither dared to repeat too loudly. She pulled a folded paper from beneath her shawl and spread it across a hay bale, pointing at a line that cut through the hills beyond the village. He bent over it, eyes narrowing as he traced the path with a calloused finger. "They won't expect us to move this soon," she said. "They should," he replied. "I've been waiting for a night like this." As their whispered plans filled the barn, the figure outside stepped closer, boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. Unseen, a pair of sharp eyes peered through a crack in the wall, catching the glow of the lantern and the silhouettes inside. The watcher's hand tightened around something, a weapon, or perhaps a signal. Neither of them knew they were no longer alone. The wind howled once more, slamming the barn door slightly as if trying to warn them. But they were too deep in their plotting to notice. Their fates were tying together with each whispered word, each risky decision. In a village that prided itself on quiet evenings and steady routines, they were about to light a fire that no one could put out. And outside, in the dark, the first spark of danger was already watching, waiting for its moment to strike. The next morning came with a low fog clinging to the valley, stretching across the fields like a pale shroud. Roosters had crowed before sunrise, but the air still held a heaviness that made the village seem slower to wake. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys as families began their daily chores. Wagon wheels creaked on the damp road. Horses snorted against their harnesses, and shopkeepers lifted their shutters with the same tired rhythm they had known for years. But beneath the surface of routine, something felt different. Conversations at the general store were shorter. People glanced over their shoulders more than usual. Even the old men sitting outside the saloon with their morning coffee seemed unusually quiet. News had not traveled yet. Not exactly, but unease had a way of moving without words. She walked through the square with her shawl wrapped tightly around her, eyes lowered, but senses sharp. After the secret meeting in the barn, her heartbeat hadn't fully calmed. She replayed every whispered word, every glance, every decision they'd made. There was no turning back now. She had spent years running from shadows, moving from town to town, hoping to disappear. But this place, this quiet village surrounded by hills and thick woods, had drawn her in for a reason she couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was the way the land felt old and watchful, or maybe it was him. She passed the sheriff's office and caught sight of the deputy leaning against the porch rail, squinting at her with the suspicion of someone who had nothing else to do but watch. He was a thin man with a patchy beard and a habit of spitting between sentences. She gave a polite nod, nothing more. The less attention she drew, the better. At the general store, the bell over the door chimed as she stepped inside. The familiar smell of coffee grounds, leather, and kerosene greeted her. Behind the counter, the storekeeper's wife gave her a long look, as she always did. It wasn't outright hostility, just a quiet curiosity. In a place where everyone knew each other's families for generations, strangers were like ripples on still water. She bought flour, sugar, and a small tin of oil, just enough to make her presence seem ordinary. As she reached for the coins in her purse, she heard two men by the barrels near the back talking in hushed voices. "Found the tracks again down by the creek," one said. "Not horse, not cattle either." "Could be a drifter," the other replied. "Or someone hunting, in the same place 3 nights in a row." Their words stuck in her mind as she stepped out into the cool air. Tracks near the creek. That was close to where she and he had agreed their route would begin. If someone else was lurking out there, it complicated everything. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, he stood at the edge of his ranch, staring out over the fields. The fog was lifting now, revealing fences, barns, and distant hills. His hands were rough from years of work, but they rested against the fence rail with a kind of stillness that came from deep thought. He had lived here long enough to know every inch of land, every sound, every shift in the air. And lately, something had been off. 2 nights ago, one of his horses had come back with a gash along its flank. Last night, dogs had barked toward the woods long after midnight. He'd gone out with his rifle, but all he'd found were broken branches and the faint sense of being watched. He didn't scare easily. He'd faced worse things than animals in the dark, but this was different. When he rode into town later that morning, he didn't go straight to her. That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, he tied his horse near the blacksmith's and made his way toward the saloon. Inside, the air smelled of stale liquor and sawdust. A few men were already drinking even though the day had barely begun. He sat near the window, ordered coffee, and waited. Eventually, a man in a dark coat entered, a man he knew well. They shared no greetings, just a slight nod. The man took the seat across from him. "You sure about her?" the man asked quietly, eyes flicking toward the street. "I don't doubt her," he replied, "but I don't trust the town. There's talk about strangers in the woods." "There's always talk," he said, though his jaw tightened. The man leaned forward. "If we're going through with this, you need to know something. The railroad men are getting restless. They've sent riders ahead, and if they find out what you're planning, they'll make sure neither of you makes it out alive." He didn't flinch. "Then we better be faster." Back at her rented room above the general store, she spread the map out again on the small table. The thin paper was marked with hand-drawn routes, circles, and cryptic notes in faded ink. She traced the line with her finger, following the path through the hills, past the creek, into the narrow canyon that led out of the valley. It was risky, but it was the only way. She glanced at the small trunk by her bed. Inside were the things she'd carried for years. A few clothes, a locket with a faded photograph, a folded letter, and something heavier wrapped in cloth. She didn't like to touch it unless she had to. It reminded her of the night she'd first run, the night everything changed. Outside her window, the street below was alive with the usual bustle, but a small detail caught her attention. A man she didn't recognize stood across the way, pretending to adjust his saddle. He was too clean, too careful. His eyes swept the building before he turned away. She closed the curtains slowly. Someone was watching. That evening, just before sunset, she met him again. This time not in the barn, but in the shadow of the old mill by the river. The water rushed over the stones, masking their voices. He leaned against the wooden frame, hat pulled low, eyes alert. "They're closing in," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "I saw 2 riders heading up the ridge this afternoon. Didn't recognize them. We don't have long. If they find the map—" "They won't," he cut in. "I've taken care of that." His calm tone steadied her more than she expected. He had a way of making plans feel solid, even when everything around them was shifting. But as they spoke, neither noticed the faint glint of light on the opposite hill, the reflection of a spyglass trained directly on them. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The village below looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, like a stage before the curtain rose on a dangerous act. Children laughed near the well, dogs chased each other down the road, and lanterns began to glow in windows one by one. But behind that calm, forces were moving. Riders were already gathering beyond the hills. Men in long coats whispered by the creek. A signal would be given soon. She looked at him, her voice low but firm. "If this goes wrong, you know what they'll do to us." He met her gaze, steady as ever. "Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong." She wanted to believe him. She almost did, but something in the air that night told her the danger wasn't just out there. It was already inside the town, weaving itself into familiar faces, waiting for the right moment to show its teeth. As the last light disappeared, a lone owl hooted from the forest. The sound carried across the fields, eerie and long. Somewhere in the dark, the watcher from the barn adjusted his hat and mounted his horse. He had heard enough. The clock in the saloon struck 8. The streets grew quiet. One by one, lanterns went out, and the village returned to its usual nighttime stillness. But under that silence, the story was tightening, like a rope slowly being pulled taut. They were getting closer to whatever storm was coming. And none of them, not her, not him, not the people in town, could stop it now. Night settled like a blanket over the valley, heavy and still, the kind that made every creak of wood and distant hoofbeat sound sharper. The moon was just a thin curve in the sky, offering little light. A hush had fallen over the village, but under that quiet, something was stirring. He stood near the edge of the barn, watching the tree line with narrowed eyes. The dogs had barked again earlier, and this time it wasn't at a passing wagon or coyote. It was something closer, something that stayed just out of sight. He could feel it in the way the horses shifted nervously in their stalls, ears pricked toward the woods. He tightened his grip on the lantern, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Across town, in her small rented room, she sat by the window with her knees drawn up, listening to the night. The silence was deceptive. She had lived long enough on the road to know when danger was near. It didn't always arrive with noise. It often crept in quietly like a snake through tall grass. She thought of the stranger she'd seen earlier watching from across the street. He hadn't returned, but the image of his sharp gaze stuck with her. She wondered who had sent him. In the sheriff's office, a different kind of unease was growing. The sheriff was a broad, tired man who had spent more than 20 years keeping the peace in that valley. He'd seen bar fights, theft, and the occasional outlaw passing through, but lately he'd noticed changes he couldn't ignore. Too many tracks in places where no traveler should have been. Too many quiet looks exchanged between people who usually didn't have business together. And then there were the railroad men, riders coming in and out of town with tight-lipped faces and papers they didn't want anyone to see. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stared at the map pinned to the wall. It showed the village, the surrounding hills, the river, and the unfinished railroad line that cut like a scar through the north. That line was supposed to bring prosperity, but lately it felt more like a shadow creeping closer. He tapped his finger on the section near the creek, the same area where strange tracks had been found. Something was happening there. Meanwhile, at the edge of town near the ridge, two men sat by a dying campfire. Their horses were tied nearby, restless. They weren't locals. Their boots were too polished, their coats too fine, their eyes too sharp. One held a spyglass, the same one that had been trained on her and him near the old mill. "You saw them?" the younger man asked, leaning forward. "Plain as day," the older replied. "They're planning something." She had a map. He was marking it. "You think they know about the shipment? I think they know enough to be a problem." The younger man threw a stick into the fire. "Then we tell the others. If they move first, they won't make it far." "Not yet," the older man said calmly. "We wait, let them lead us to the rest. No use catching minnows when there's a bigger fish waiting." Back in town, she met him again, this time behind the livery stable where no one would overhear them. She had wrapped her shawl tight and her voice was low and tense. "They're watching us," she whispered. "I saw one of them near the ridge before sunset." He nodded slowly. "I saw movement by the barn last night. Whoever they are, they're patient." She unfolded the map between them. "We can't wait any longer. If we stay, they'll box us in." His eyes lingered on the map, then lifted to hers. "If we move too soon, we walk into their hands. We need to know who's leading this." She hesitated. "I think I know." He didn't speak, just waited. "There's a name I keep hearing in whispers," she said finally. "Carter. He used to run with the railroad men, but they say he started working both sides, moving goods, information, whatever would earn him the most. He's ruthless. If he's here, this isn't just about us." He absorbed that in silence. The name wasn't new to him. Years ago, he'd crossed paths with Carter during a rough winter in the Southern Territories. Men like him didn't just vanish. They grew like weeds in places people weren't watching. The following day brought a thin drizzle that slicked the streets and muddied the roads leading out of town. Wagons moved slower, boots squelched in the damp earth, and the fog never quite lifted from the hills. It was the kind of weather that made folks stay indoors, but for some it made it easier to move unseen. Near the creek, two deputies on patrol found something that made their blood run cold. The remains of a small camp still warm from a fire. Boot prints circled the site, leading off in several directions. One of the men picked up a piece of paper half buried in the mud. It was part of a map, not a full one, but enough to show a line leading from the ridge through the canyon. They brought it back to the sheriff. He studied it under the dim light of his office, his jaw tightening with each second. He didn't know whose map it was, but he knew trouble when he saw it. Later that evening, she made her way to the barn again, moving quickly through the rain-slick alleyways. When she arrived, he was already there, pacing. His shirt clung to him from the drizzle, and his eyes were sharp, restless. "They found something near the creek," he said as soon as she entered. "Sheriff's deputies were asking questions in town." She froze. "The map? I don't know how much, but it's enough to put everyone on edge." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If the sheriff gets involved, this gets messy. We can't fight on two fronts, him and Carter's men." He ran a hand through his damp hair, thinking. "Then we need to make a choice. Either we disappear before they close in, or we turn this around before they realize what we're carrying." She glanced at the trunk she had brought with her. It was small but heavy. Inside were documents that could ruin men like Carter and the railroad partners who had paid for silence and land. She hadn't trusted anyone with it until him. Together, they planned to move it through the canyon and hand it off to someone waiting on the other side. But if word got out too soon, they'd never make it. Meanwhile, at the saloon, a subplot was unfolding quietly. The barkeep, a wiry man with quick hands and quicker ears, overheard two railroad riders talking near the back room. They mentioned Carter's name, the ridge, and something about cutting off loose ends. When they left, he leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers nervously. He'd kept out of trouble for years, but something about this felt different. He slipped out the back and made his way toward the sheriff's office, unsure whether he was about to help or hang himself. By nightfall, tensions had reached a breaking point. The sheriff rode out toward the ridge with two deputies, following the muddy trail left behind by Carter's men. She and he prepared to leave, packing the trunk and rolling up the map, knowing they couldn't wait much longer. But as they hitched the horses in the dark, the barn door creaked behind them. A figure stepped out of the shadows, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. His voice was calm, almost casual. "You two look like you're about to go somewhere." She froze. He stepped between her and the stranger, hand near his holster. "Carter's been waiting for this," the man said with a slow smile. "And here you are, making it so easy." Before either of them could speak, a whistle cut through the night, sharp, short, and answered from somewhere near the tree line. More figures emerged, boots squelching in the wet ground. They were surrounded. The tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. Rain tapped against the barn roof, horses shifted nervously, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. The story they had set in motion had finally caught up to them, and every choice they'd made now teetered on a knife's edge. The night wasn't going to end quietly. Rain poured harder, a steady curtain that blurred the edges of the barn and softened the sound of approaching boots. The lantern light inside flickered against the damp wood, throwing uneven shadows across their faces. She stood beside the trunk, her shawl clinging to her shoulders, heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. He shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between her and the men stepping out of the darkness. There were at least half a dozen of them, their coats soaked, their eyes glinting beneath the brims of their hats. The man in front was the same one she had seen across the street days ago, the Watcher. Up close, his face was lean and sharp, his expression both amused and cold. "Evenin'," he said casually, though there was nothing friendly in his tone. "Miserable night for travel. You sure you two want to be out here?" He didn't answer, just narrowed his eyes. She could feel the tension radiating off him. His fingers hovered near his belt, not threatening but ready. The Watcher tilted his head slightly. "No sense pretending. We know what you're carrying. And Carter, well, he's real interested in that little trunk you've got there." Her grip on the shawl tightened. "It doesn't belong to him," she said, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. The man chuckled softly. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But you see, it ain't about who it belongs to. It's about who's willing to bleed for it. And right now, you two don't look like you got enough bullets to change the outcome." Outside, the whistle came again, two short bursts. Somewhere in the trees, horses shifted. The Watcher's men fanned out, their boots splashing in the mud, cutting off every exit. The barn suddenly felt much smaller, the air thicker. He leaned closer to her and murmured, "We're not giving it up. No matter what happens, we stick to the plan." She nodded, her jaws set. But inside, panic clawed at her chest. If Carter's men got the documents, everything would fall apart. The corruption tied to the railroad, the land theft, the murders, they'd all be buried for good. And no one would ever know. The Watcher took a step forward, his hand resting lazily on the handle of his revolver. "I'll make it easy. Hand it over and maybe Carter lets you keep breathing long enough to ride out of town. Refuse and—" He smiled faintly. "Well, the rain makes digging shallow graves real easy." Before either of them could respond, the sound of distant hooves broke through the downpour. Everyone froze. The Watcher turned his head slightly, listening. More riders were coming. She felt a spark of hope. It might have been the sheriff. But as the hoofbeats grew louder, the Watcher grinned. Looks like the boss decided to show up himself. From the ridge, a group of riders emerged, lanterns swinging from their saddles, casting long beams of light through the rain. At the front rode a broad-shouldered man wrapped in a dark oilskin coat. His hat was pulled low, but she recognized him the moment he spoke. "Well now," Carter drawled, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "Ain't this a sight? Two little thieves think they can outrun me." He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the wet earth. His men followed, forming a loose circle around the barn. The watcher stepped aside, nodding to him like a loyal hound. Carter scanned the scene with calm, calculating eyes, stopping briefly on her. "You gave me a bit of trouble," he said. "I admire that. But admiration don't change outcomes." He turned his gaze to the trunk. "That belongs to me." "It never did," she shot back. He smirked. "Everything in this valley belongs to me. Some folks just don't realize it yet." The barn was surrounded now. The rain masked some sounds but made others sharper. The creak of saddles, the metallic clicks as weapons were checked, the occasional stomp of impatient horses. Every detail added to the rising pressure like the air before a storm breaks. He leaned toward her again, speaking low. "We still have one way out. Through the north gate, down the ravine. But we'll have to move fast," she whispered back. "They'll see us. They'll have to choose between chasing us or protecting Carter," he said. His eyes were already scanning their surroundings, calculating. Before they could act, Carter raised his hand slightly, signaling his men to step closer. "I'm feeling generous tonight," he said smoothly. "Hand over the trunk and maybe I let you walk out with all your limbs." The watcher's grin widened. "They ain't got much time to decide." The tension was unbearable now, every breath heavy, every movement deliberate. She could feel the weight of the trunk beside her like it was alive, pulsing with the risk they'd taken. She remembered the night spent gathering evidence, the whispered deals she'd overheard, the documents she'd smuggled out at great risk. This was what it had all led to, a muddy, rain-soaked standoff in the dark. Then from behind Carter's men, another sound cut through the rain. Gunshots. Sharp, unexpected, echoing from the direction of the ridge. Carter's men jerked their heads around. A rider came barreling down the hill, shouting something lost in the storm. For a split second, confusion broke their formation. He seized the moment. "Now!" he hissed. She grabbed the trunk as he shoved open the barn's back door. They sprinted through the rain toward the ravine, boots splashing in the mud. Shouts erupted behind them. Carter's voice roared like thunder. "Get them!" Bullets cracked through the night, some hitting the barn, others kicking up mud near their feet. She held the trunk tight to her chest, breath burning in her lungs. He ran slightly ahead, guiding them down the slippery path toward the narrow ravine that cut through the hills. The rain made everything slick, every step a risk. Behind them, hoofbeats thundered. Carter's men had mounted quickly, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they gave chase. She glanced back once and saw the watcher riding hard, his eyes locked on them. They reached the mouth of the ravine, where the ground narrowed into a muddy chute between rocky walls. The sound of water rushing below filled the air. He jumped down first, helping her lower the trunk before sliding in himself. The path was treacherous, and the rain had turned it into a slick mess, but it was their only chance. As they made their way deeper, voices echoed above them. Carter's men were splitting up, some following the ravine, others circling ahead. They knew the land, too. He pulled her behind a cluster of boulders, both of them panting, soaked to the bone. The trunk sat between them like a fragile prize. He looked at her, his expression serious. "They won't stop," he said quietly. "They'll chase us to the edge of the world for what's in that trunk." She nodded, wiping rain from her face. "Then we keep going. If we stop now, everything was for nothing." Above them, lantern light flickered against the wet rocks as riders searched from the ledge. The watcher's voice echoed faintly, giving orders. They were closing in. The rain showed no sign of easing. Thunder rolled in the distance. Every sound seemed amplified in the ravine. The clatter of hooves above, the rustle of water below, their own labored breathing. He glanced toward the bend in the ravine ahead. "If we make it through there, we'll reach the canyon. After that, it's a straight shot to the handoff point." She didn't respond. She just grabbed one handle of the trunk while he took the other. Together, they moved forward through the narrow passage, shadows swallowing them as the storm raged overhead. Behind them, Carter's men began descending into the ravine, their lanterns casting erratic, swinging beams through the darkness. The watcher was among them, his movements deliberate and confident. He wasn't just chasing, he was hunting. The chase was tightening. The night was no longer just a backdrop. It was a living thing pressing in around them, testing their resolve. Each step forward brought them closer to the canyon, but it also drew Carter's men nearer. As they rounded the bend, they froze. Ahead, the path split into two narrow trails, both slick and dangerous. One led toward the canyon. The other veered off into the dark woods, a gamble they hadn't planned for. and from the shouts behind them, it was clear they wouldn't have much time to choose. The rain pounded harder, thunder cracked, lantern light flickered against the rock walls. They looked at each other, breathless, soaked and cornered, knowing that the next choice they made would decide everything. The climax was coming, fast, like a storm about to break over their heads. The wind howled through the ravine, mixing with the rain in a relentless chorus. She and he stood at the fork in the path, the trunk heavy between them, the water rushing below echoing every heartbeat. They could hear the shouts of Carter's men, the pounding of hooves on the slick earth, the faint whistle of the watcher giving commands. The choice had to be made now. He tightened his grip on the trunk. "We take the canyon trail. Faster, and it keeps us out of the woods where they could flank us." She nodded, her muscles straining from the effort. "I trust you." Together they darted toward the narrower path, feet slipping on mud and rocks. Water splashed around their ankles, soaking them further, but they pressed on. The canyon narrowed above them, jagged rock walls rising on either side, forcing them to move single file. Every step felt like a gamble, but the weight of the trunk, the years of planning, and the stakes ahead gave them a determination that pushed past exhaustion. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew. Carter's men had split up, some descending into the canyon after them while others attempted to cut them off from higher ground. The watcher remained close, his silhouette occasionally illuminated by the flashes of lightning from the storm above. As they rounded a sharp bend, they spotted a narrow ledge leading down to a smaller stream, a shortcut he had remembered from previous travels through these hills. "This way," he said, voice low but urgent. He helped her down first, then followed, both moving cautiously to avoid slipping into the rushing water below. The ledge was treacherous, but it gave them a momentary advantage. Carter's men were too large to navigate it quickly, and some hesitated, shouting at each other as they tried to find a safer route. She allowed herself a quick glance back, heart pounding. Lanterns bobbed through the mist, but they weren't catching up yet. When the ledge ended, they stepped onto firmer ground at the bottom of the canyon. The roar of the water had lessened, replaced by the rhythmic sound of their boots on packed mud. They set the trunk down for a moment, catching their breath. Their soaked clothing clung to their bodies and the chill of the rain seeped into their bones, but the sense of momentary safety was intoxicating. "We keep moving," he said. "We're not out of this yet." She nodded, wiping rain from her face. Every instinct screamed that the danger was still close, but there was also a sense of purpose. Finally, every step they'd taken led here, and there was still hope. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the storm began to ease. Rain lessened to a fine drizzle, and clouds above broke just enough for the moon to peek through, casting pale silver light on the rocks and water. It illuminated something else, a figure waiting ahead on the other side of a shallow creek, partially hidden by shadows. She froze for a moment before he whispered, "It's them, the ones we're supposed to meet." A pair of riders emerged fully, lanterns swinging, horses stamping in the mud. They waved, signaling the way forward. Relief washed over her, but she didn't relax completely. This wasn't over. Carter's men could regroup, the watcher could still be following, and the valley behind them was still full of eyes. He stepped forward, leading her and the trunk toward the riders. "We've got what you need," he called out, voice steady despite the storm. The riders dismounted, helping them lift the trunk onto the horses. She watched as the documents were secured, finally out of their hands, safe for now. One of the riders, a man with a kind, worn face, looked at her and nodded. "You did well. This changes things. Men like Carter won't have the power to bury this anymore." She allowed herself a small smile, exhausted but relieved. Every ounce of fear and tension from the night seemed to release, though she knew it wasn't entirely over. There would still be consequences, still be challenges, but the immediate danger had passed. He stepped beside her, muddy and soaked, looking toward the canyon exit. "We made it," he said simply. Not triumphantly, not boastfully, just the calm acknowledgement of survival. She glanced at him, noticing the way the moonlight caught his sharp features, the way his eyes softened just slightly. "We did," she echoed. Behind them, in the distance, faint shouts carried from the direction of the ravine, but no one followed. The storm in the canyon had created a barrier, buying them time. Carter's men would regroup, but for now, they were safe. As the night quieted, they made their way up the final slope, the valley stretching out before them in silver light. The village was far below, silent now, with only the sound of water and wind marking its presence. She thought of the people they had left behind, the sheriff, the barkeep, the deputies, and the small acts of courage that had kept them informed and alive. Even in a town filled with quiet routines and dusty streets, bravery existed in subtle ways. He glanced at her. "What now?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We keep going. We rest, we regroup, and we make sure what's in that trunk reaches the people who need it. Carter and his men will fade from these hills eventually, but the truth," she lifted her head, letting the wind carry her words, "the truth has a way of finding its own path." For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe fully, the tension draining slowly from her shoulders. She thought about the choices that had led them here, the risks, the whispered plans, the nights of fear and anticipation. Each decision had mattered, and each had been a step toward survival. He looked out over the valley, rain still dripping from his hat. "We've got a long road ahead," he said. "But I think maybe this town will remember what we did, even if they never see our faces again." She nodded. "That's enough." She realized in that moment that survival wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about keeping hope alive, about ensuring that what they fought for mattered beyond their own lives. The moon broke fully through the clouds, casting light over the canyon and hills beyond. It highlighted the path they would take, and for the first time it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a beginning. They moved forward together, wet, tired, but unbroken. The night had tested them in every way, but it had also proven something essential: courage, trust, and determination could bend even the sharpest edge of danger. As they disappeared into the canyon, leaving the valley behind, the first faint signs of dawn began to touch the sky. Silver clouds gave way to pale streaks of gold, promising a new day. The village below would awaken, unaware of the peril that had passed so close to its streets, unaware of the plans and the risks, unaware that two people had defied men like Carter and his hired hunters to protect something far greater than themselves. The trunk, secured and moving forward, carried more than documents. It carried justice, accountability, and the chance for change in a valley long accustomed to quiet routines and hidden dangers. And as the first birds began to call in the morning light, she realized something else. The world was bigger than fear, and courage could be quiet, unseen, yet unbreakable. They walked on through the canyon, side by side, each step taking them closer to safety, closer to the future they had fought for, knowing that some battles leave scars, some nights leave memories, and some choices shape lives far beyond what anyone could imagine. The rain finally eased, leaving the earth fragrant, the canyon walls glistening. She glanced at him once more, then forward. Words weren't necessary. The trust, the bond, the shared struggle spoke more loudly than anything could. The sun rose fully now, painting the valley in warm gold, washing over the mud-slicked hills, the abandoned paths, the quiet village far below. A new day had begun, and with it the promise that while danger and deceit may linger in hidden corners, truth and courage could still find a way. Together, they moved forward, leaving the shadows of the night behind, carrying the lessons, the fear, and the triumph with them. And for the first time in a long time, the valley felt like a place where hope could grow again.